January 1864. Europe was on the brink of a monumental struggle, the first of 3 wars that would determine its fate for generations to come. In the heart of German-speaking territories, a long-standing conundrum known as the German question had left its people in a state of unease for decades. In the tumultuous aftermath of the 1848 revolutions, German nationalists were determined to bring together all German territories under one banner. This led to a fierce debate surrounding the German question, which presented 2 potential paths to a solution. The Lesser Germany, Kleindeutschland, which was heavily favored by Prussia and would have seen Austria excluded from the envisioned unified state, and the Greater Germany, Großdeutschland, supported by Austria and led by the illustrious House of Habsburg. The rivalry between Prussia and Austria was defined by intense territorial battles and was underpinned by a range of economic, cultural, and political factors. It all began with the Silesian Wars and the 7 Years' War, which saw the Prussian King Frederick the Great conquering Silesia. Since then, both states have been locked in a relentless struggle for supremacy over the German territories. With a history that spans centuries and a reputation as one of the most powerful dynasties in European history, the Habsburg Empire was a great contender in the quest to resolve the German question in their favor. Despite the numerous challenges that plagued their history, they had proven themselves to be a force to be reckoned with, and many believed that their power and influence would tip the scales in their favor. Nothing has been spared in this world. Emperor Franz Joseph. The revolutions of 1848 spared no one, and the empire was no exception. Uprisings in Italian territories, Hungary, and Vienna culminated in the resignation of Chancellor Prince Metternich, a political titan in post-Napoleonic Europe. It marked the end of an era. Taking over from his incapacitated uncle Ferdinand, a new, young, and dynamic monarch faced a daunting task. The Hungarian Revolution escalated into a war of independence, and the wounds from other 1848 revolutions were still raw in the memory of the empire. In March 1849, King Charles Albert of Sardinia attempted to exploit the unstable situation, launching the First Italian War of Independence, which further exacerbated the already complex political landscape. The talented Field Marshal Count Radetzky devised a cunning strategy to crush the rebellion at Novara. The Austrian Empire was not out of the woods yet, and to quell the Hungarian Revolution they had to turn to the Russian Tsar Nicholas for military aid. In line with the goals of the Holy Alliance, the Tsar obliged and sent an army. Austria was grateful for the support of their eastern ally, even if it meant owing them a debt of gratitude. After the dust had settled, the young emperor faced a new set of challenges. The new prime minister, Prince Felix of Schwarzenberg, helped to steady the ship of state. He proved to be a master of diplomacy, navigating complex negotiations with ease. Like Metternich before him, Schwarzenberg skillfully prevented Prussia's attempts to exclude Austria from a new German federation. However, Schwarzenberg's sudden death in 1852 left the emperor without a competent advisor, forcing him to take on the role of the prime minister himself. The Emperor of Austria has many ministers, but when he wants something done, he has to do it himself. Otto von Bismarck, 1851. The next few years would test the emperor's mettle, as he was forced to make critical decisions without the guidance of a trusted counselor. Austria's position as a great power was severely weakened by its unwillingness to aid Russia during the Crimean War. Their betrayal and subsequent loss of its alliance with Russia left Austria isolated on the international stage. The emperor's foreign policy blunders would have disastrous consequences in the years to come. Moreover, the great Count Radetzky, who had crushed the Italian War of Independence, passed away in 1857. His successor, The inept Gyulai was indebted to court intrigue for his position. Meanwhile, Austria found itself isolated on the international stage. This isolation proved to be a temptation for the Emperor of France, Napoleon III, to revive his dream of a new Bonapartist rule in Italy. In 1858, he conspired with Italian statesman Cavour to banish Austria from northern Italy. Russia, desiring to see Austria weakened, agreed to remain neutral. In April of 1859, Sardinia was called upon to disarm by an ultimatum, provoking war. The French had enough time to come to Sardinia's aid, and the first battle, Magenta, was fought on Austrian soil. Although indecisive, it further demoralized the Austrian commanders, who retreated. In June, the Austrians attempted to replicate Radetzky's victory at Custoza, but instead they stumbled into the French at Solferino. The two ancient war machines collided in a display of incompetence, and the French, by chance, emerged victorious. Solferino had a profound effect on Franz Josef's confidence in his army. He had lost his faith in its strength, and he feared that it would bring only more defeats in the future. On the other hand, Napoleon III was no fool. He feared that the Habsburgs might appeal to German nationalism, which could lead to war on the Rhine. He wanted to avoid this at all costs, and so despite being defeated, Austria received generous terms. They only had to surrender Lombardy and retained Venetia, ensuring they remained an Italian power. The great Italian conflict had ended without much spectacle. The military might of the empire had suffered a severe blow. The crushing defeat at Solferino had left a deep wound in the army's pride. The War of 1859 dealt a blow to Austria's foreign policy and called for an urgent need for change. Count Johann von Rechberg took over as the new chancellor and strived to restore the Holy Alliance, but his efforts fell flat. The appointment of von Schmerling as the new Austrian interior minister led to a shift in the empire's outlook. He presented Austria as a German state with an obsession for a greater German solution to the German question, which put it in direct opposition to Prussia's interests. In 1863, von Schmerling convinced Franz Josef to support the idea of reforming the German Confederation under Austrian leadership. The practical expression of this policy was the meeting of German princes in Frankfurt in August of the same year. However, the King of Prussia declined the invitation to the meeting, and without his presence, the German princes refused to take any significant action. Later that autumn, Prussia rejected Austria's demand for inclusion in the Zollverein, a coalition of German states formed to manage tariffs and economic policies. The animosity between both powers had never been higher, with the exception of actual war. If it would come to war, Austria knew it would struggle to find any allies. Despite Napoleon's offer of support, Franz Joseph refused to surrender his Italian lands. This decision further isolated Austria, which had already been estranged from Russia. As a result, Austria found itself in a precarious situation with no real friends or allies. However, on November 15, 1863, Frederick VII of Denmark passed away. A complex succession crisis and sequence of events followed, culminating in a joint decision by Austria and Prussia to invade the lands of Schleswig-Holstein. The sudden change in the Austro-Prussian relationship was quite remarkable. The previous decade had been characterized by intense rivalry and animosity, yet now a sense of harmony and cooperation seemed to have taken over. However, this newfound camaraderie masked a pandemonium of conflicting expectations and intentions. Count Johann von Rechberg, in particular, saw the joint campaign as an opportunity to prevent Prussia from securing significant gains at the expense of Austria and Denmark. Behind his calculations, however, was a more sinister prospect. Napoleon III was eyeing Schleswig-Holstein and the northern states of Germany for Prussia's annexation, with France's support. This hinted that Paris was keen on another anti-Austrian war, with Prussia leading the charge. Being fully informed by Bismarck of these developments, Rechberg knew that the Austrian Empire could not afford to enter such a costly conflict. Bismarck's design was a stark contrast to the Austrians. The German Confederation held no sway over his plans, and his aim was to seize the two duchies and incorporate them into the Prussian kingdom. The esteemed Prussian Chief of Staff, Helmut von Moltke, was a crucial element in this endeavour. Moltke harboured strong opposition to the idea of transforming the duchies into an autonomous principality. His reasoning was that this new entity could become a mere pawn of the Habsburgs, creating a gaping hole in Prussia's northern maritime borders. As Bismarck knew, a unilateral annexation could expose Prussia to retribution from Austria, the rest of the Confederation, and even multiple European powers. The agreement with Austria was only a temporary measure, designed to limit risk and keep all options open. Despite the resistance of the Federal Assembly of the German Confederation, the Prussian and Austrian troops crossed into Schleswig on the 1st of February 1864, plunging the region into war. In the early days of the war, the Danish army fielded around 38,000 men across 4 divisions, with 36,000 of these stationed at the formidable Dannevirke. Field Marshal Friedrich Graf von Wrangel took the reins as supreme commander of the Prussian-Austrian army, while General Ludwig von Gablenz led the Austrian troops. The Prussian forces, on the other hand, boasted an army of 37 battalions, 29 squadrons, and 110 guns, amounting to approximately 38,400 soldiers. The Austrian army commanded 20 battalions, 10 squadrons, and 48 guns, numbering around 23,000 soldiers. The Danes were not to be easily defeated, however, utilizing a series of fortifications known as the Dannevirke. The Austrians engaged the Danes in a frontal attack on the refortified Dannevirke, while the Prussian forces launched an assault on the Danish fortifications at Maisunda, attempting to bypass the line of defense. One day after the Battle of Maisunda, where the Danes managed to repel the Prussians, the Austrians, led by General Gondrecourt, clashed with the Danish army at the Battle for Königshügel. Surely you can do as well as the old ass Radetzky. Telegram from the Habsburg Emperor to Commander-in-Chief, Ferenc, July, 1859. As the sun rose, the Austrian army, under the command of Major General Gondrecourt, marched towards the west of the Prussian forces. He commanded a force of over 4,500 infantry soldiers. An Austrian vanguard approached and easily seized the strategic position of Fahrdorf. Without a fight, Lieutenant General Steinmann led a division of 3 battalions and 4 guns from the Danish side towards Selk. The Austrians knew that Fahrdorf was critical, for it was the gateway to the Dannevirke, and they wanted to ensure that the Danes would not surprise them from the flanks. As the sun reached its highest point in the sky, the Gondrecourt Brigade, consisting of 4 battalions, emerged from the south and marched past Breckendorf. Their advance was halted by a Danish vanguard battalion, but the Austrians were undeterred. A battalion of the 30th Regiment swiftly moved to the right of the path, while a Jaeger battalion, under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel von Tobias, approached from the left. The Danes sought refuge behind the hedgerows of the nearby moorland, forming their defensive positions. But the Austrians continued to push forward relentlessly, often fighting at the tip of the bayonets. The Danish vanguard, recognizing the superiority of their enemy, began a steady retreat towards Selk, pursued by the Austrians. As the Austrian army closed in on Selk, the sound of clashing metal and roaring gunfire erupted. The Danes, stationed behind their fortifications, quickly realized that they were under attack. They sprang into action, unleashing a barrage of bullets and artillery shells towards the advancing enemy. The Austrians, however, were not deterred. The battle was fierce, but neither side gained any significant advantage, and for the time being, a full-blown assault was held at bay. The sound of battle warned the Danish infantry in the rear. Sensing danger, they emerged from the safety of Danevirke and advanced onto the battlefield. The 11th Regiment, commanded by Major Rist, marched ahead. Close behind them were Captain Thalbritz's battalion of the 2nd Regiment and Major Sarbai's battalion of the 21st Regiment. Sarbai moved to Jagel to secure the southern flank. Meanwhile, their sister battalion of the 21st Regiment stationed themselves along the fortifications at Königshügel, a prehistoric burial mound and natural elevation that towered over the battlefield. Captain Modricki of the Gondrecourt Brigade led his battery to a strategic position on the front plateau north of Selb. He provided artillery support by bombarding the Danish guns stationed at Königshügel. Meanwhile, the Austrian Jaeger Battalion advanced to attack Selb, engaging in a fierce battle with the Danish soldiers. Despite the Danes' best efforts, the Austrians emerged victorious, with the bayonet charge turning the tide of the battle. The Danes suffered heavy losses, losing 79 soldiers and 25 more captured. The Austrians seized the village. Amidst the chaos, Major Rist rode back to Königshügel to take stock of the situation. The main post and its relief were in position with approximately 24 companies of Danish soldiers. However, the Austrians outnumbered them at least 4-1, making the situation seem dire for the Danish troops. Upon securing Selk, Gondrecourt wasted no time in strategizing his next move. He realized that to solidify their hold on the village, they had to seize Königshügel on the opposite end. The Austrians, meanwhile, planned their attack with a barrage of artillery fire before advancing their infantry. With Jaeger battalions leading the charge, and Austrian battalions of the 9th Regiment, with reinforcements from a battalion of the 20th Regiment, charged directly towards Königshügel and Busdorf, bracing for battle. Despite the strong position they held, Major Rist chose to defend Königshügel by physical combat, instead of stopping the enemy's attack with musket fire. To carry out his strategy, all companies except for the right wing were gradually deployed for bayonet attacks. Then they charged. The intense battle between the Danes and the Austrians quickly erupted into brutal close combat. The Austrians clearly had the upper hand and numerical superiority. The Danish companies found themselves in disarray. Despite their repeated attempts to counterattack, their fighting spirit was shattered by the ruthless onslaught of the Austrian forces. Undeterred by the heavy fire, the Austrians marched forward with unwavering resolve, leaving a trail of death and destruction in their wake. Even the fallen soldiers were cast aside with a cold and calculated efficiency. The Danish forces found themselves being pushed back on all fronts. 2 Austrian battalions launched a fierce assault on the hill, forcing the Danish right flank to retreat. Even the remaining battalions that had survived the previous bayonet charge were unable to hold their ground and were forced to fall back. By 4 o'clock, the Austrians had succeeded in capturing Königshügel. The Danes retreated onto the plateau, and the Austrian vanguard stayed put, preparing for the next assault. The battle was not over yet. Further south, Major Sabi and his troops were stationed north of Jagel, with the intent to block any advancing Austrians flanking their troops from the south. An Austrian battalion from Lottorf, accompanied by a cavalry division, had been dispatched late in the afternoon to confront the Danes in Jagel. The Danish vanguard attempted to fight off the Austrians, but they ended up retreating. Major Sarbier could hear the gunfire from Selk to his rear, but he had not been able to gather further details about the ongoing battle. Unaware that the Danish forces had already withdrawn from Selk, Major Sarbai initiated an attempt to recapture Jägel at around 3 p.m. Shortly after the advance began, an Austrian battalion, which had come from Selk, attacked the Danish rearguard, causing chaos and confusion. Heavy fighting broke out, as the Danish detachment was trapped from both sides and ended up being surrounded, with most of them either being killed or captured. The casualties were substantial, with 159 Danish soldiers losing their lives, and the rest were taken captive. To the north, the next phase of the battle commenced. As an Austrian Jaeger battalion held their ground in Königshügel, the rest of their troops chased the Danish army back into the opposite valley in a fierce pursuit. The Austrians were met with intense resistance as the Danes relentlessly fired their guns and artillery from the elevated position. The Austrians had to fall back to Königshügel, where they unleashed their own heavy artillery on the retreating Danes. The battle raged on until nightfall, when the fighting finally came to a halt. The capture of Königshügel proved to be a crucial strategic move for the Austrians. The prominent location of the hill provided them with a tactical advantage and insight into the entire Danevirke position. However, the victory came at a great cost to both sides. The Danes suffered immense losses, with at least 413 casualties among the dead, wounded, captured and missing. The Austrians fared no better, with a similar number of losses, but their strategic success clearly gave them an upper hand in the battle. After the first battles at Mysunde and Königshügel, the Danish High Command realized that their position at the Danevirke could not be maintained. The Commander-in-Chief, General Christian Julius de Meza, called for a council of war on the evening of February 4th. After 5 hours of intense discussion, the high-ranking officers concluded that they must abandon the Danevirke. The retreat began the following day, and by evening the last of the Danish troops had left. The hasty retreat resulted in the loss of important heavy artillery. The Danes had to leave it behind. Nearly 40,000 Danish soldiers, along with all the field artillery, faced treacherous conditions as they retreated towards Flensburg. The soldiers marched for 14 straight hours in the dead of night, braving icy roads and freezing temperatures. Despite these hardships, the number of fatalities was surprisingly low, with only 10 soldiers succumbing to the harsh elements. However, 120 soldiers were captured and 173 deserted along the way. Yet the war was far from over. The Austrians and Prussians, emboldened by their recent victories, were readying themselves for the next phase of the conflict. The outcome of the war hung in the balance, and the future of the region was at stake. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please leave a like, it really helps out the channel. If there is a topic, battle or person you would like to know more about, let me know your thoughts in a comment. I would also like to thank all my patrons and channel members for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and you want to support my work, consider joining me on Patreon. For just $1 per month, you will already gain early access to all my videos without any in-video advertisements. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.